In this short recording, I focus on the impact of climate change on mental health. First, let's define climate change and mental health, although we are quite familiar with these two terms. Climate change is defined as a change in the state of the climate that can be identified by changes in global or regional temperature or weather patterns lasting for decades or longer. So it's not a short-term change, but for several decades. It's not like today, the temperature is 40 degrees in Australia. That's a result of the climate change. But when we talk about climate change, it's the pattern lasting for decades or even longer. And what about mental health? WHO defines mental health as a state of well-being in which individuals realize their own potentials, can cope with the stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to contribute to their communities. Please note, for mental health is not about the absence of mental disorders. It's more about a state of well-being that we can realize our potentials and also cope with the stresses in our everyday life, can work productively, and also making contribution to our communities. It's not about absence of mental disorder or absence of psychological distress. It's more about a state of well-being. You may have this experience before the tropical cyclone approaching Australia or approaching the city you are living in. You feel very nervous, anxious, even before the cyclone or the severe weather events happened. And this is the impact of climate-related mental distress. And the burden of climate-related mental health conditions is very severe. For example, climate change has been widely recognized as a pressing and complex public health issue. Beyond its physical and ecological consequences, climate change is increasingly linked to the profound mental health impacts. A recent Australian study reported that among 5,483 participants, 9.4% Australian participants reported significant eco-anxiety. It's an anxiety experienced when constantly faced with problems associated with the changing climate, and 15.7 was pre-trauma stress and 25.6 was post-trauma symptom disorder, PTSD. So these are the burden of climate-related mental health conditions. Moreover, it is reported that high temperature contributed to an annual loss of 8,458 disability-adjusted life years, DALY, represented 1.8% of the total burden of mental health and behavioral disorder in Australia. What does it mean by the loss of 8,458 DALY? It means that high temperature causes 8,458 years of healthy life to be lost across Australia every year just because of high temperatures. The report of mental health well-being resilience after the 2019 to 2020 bushfires provided by Australian National University found that 12 to 18 months after the fires, individuals with high bushfire exposure reported significantly elevated levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, with 1 in 5 meeting the clinical threshold for PTSD. Moreover, Drought-affected regions reported rising rates of suicide and self-harm, with farmers and young people disproportionately affected. The statistics we provided in the previous slides is for Australia as a whole. Then what about for people living in regional, rural, and remote Australia? What are the impacts of climate changes on people living in these areas? Compared to urban areas, people living in regional, rural, and remote parts of Australia face a significantly higher risk of frequently extreme weather events and ongoing exposure to natural disasters, for example, cyclone, flooding. Severe climate events substantially reduce livability in regional, rural, and remote areas by disrupting essential aspects of daily life. For example, after flooding, then people may not have access of power, gas, or other part of their everyday life. Regional, rural, and remote communities in Australia are especially vulnerable as they rely heavily on water-intensive industries such as agriculture, which makes them particularly exposed to the risk posed by declining water security under a changing climate. For example, with the increase of temperature in these regions, then the water supply, water security is under threatened. The report, titled Climate Council of Australia's On the Front Line, Climate Change in Rural Communities, shows that climate change intensifies existing systemic disadvantage in regional, rural, and remote communities in Australia, further widen the gap between rural and urban populations. Adverse climate events such as drought and bushfires has been linked to rising rates of mental disorders among people in Australia's regional, rural, and remote areas. According to a New South Wales study, 6 months after flooding in rural Australia, individuals exposed to multiple flood-related stresses faced a significantly risk of PTSD. From what I have discussed, we can see the severe impact of climate change on mental health at a population level. From this talk, I would like to give you a couple of take-home messages. First, climate change has been widely recognized as a present and complex public health issue. Second, climate change has profound impact on mental health. This page is the references of the talk. And thank you so much for listening to my talk on the impact of climate change on mental health. If you want to listen to the talk via YouTube, please follow my channel Wendy Lee Beyond the Classroom Open Teaching and Learning. Thank you so much.